Hello and welcome to another Macbeth video giving you top grades with just one quotation. Today's quotation is, "We have scorched the snake, not killed it." And this is what Macbeth says to his wife when he discovers that Banquo has been successfully assassinated, but Fleance hasn't. As you know, he needs to kill Fleance because of the witch's prophecy, which was that Banquo's sons shall be kings, and so therefore Macbeth feels threatened. He doesn't want Fleance to become king by usurping him or assassinating him, and therefore he decides to kill Fleance early. As usual, I will be linking it to the four main themes. If you understand these themes, you can answer any question, and I will link it to at least these 7 possible question subjects. There are only these 10 possible topics that you could possibly get asked, so at the end of the video you'll have a complete understanding. Okay, we're going to go straight in with a patriarchal interpretation of this quotation. A patriarchy is a society ruled by and for the benefit of men. So we'll be looking at Macbeth, Lady Macbeth and Banquo in this part of the analysis. Well, first, the metaphor obviously suggests that Macbeth sees Banquo as a continued threat. So Banquo in this metaphor is a snake, but more importantly, his children, not just Fleance, but Fleance's son and his son's son and so on, they are also part of this snake. And it's as though he's attacked Banquo, killed him, but this is only setting fire to part of the snake. The snake will recover and be able to kill Macbeth. So he very much has in mind an assassination here. He knows that by killing Duncan, he has taught bloody instruction. In other words, he's shown all the nobles in Scotland that if they want to become king, assassination is now a legitimate way to do it. Now we can also link this to Lady Macbeth, who you remember advised Macbeth to look like the innocent flower but be the serpent under it. And Macbeth has failed. The serpent instead appears to be Banquo and Fleance. So here, this suggests that Macbeth thinks Banquo has outwitted him. Now that's important because many students simply see Banquo as a portrayal of what goodness looks like. Banquo is the kind of person Macbeth could have been if he were more noble and did not have hamartia in the form of ambition. However, Banquo is playing a really cunning game. Banquo wants the crown for his son and for the generations that come afterwards. Banquo sacrifices his own life for history. He knows that by sacrificing himself, he will be securing kingship for his sons, because he also believes in the witch's prophecies. Now we can see this as direct criticism of Lady Macbeth. When he says these words to Lady Macbeth, what he's really saying is, look, if I just waited like Banquo has done, I would have been a successful king. But instead, I listened to you, I listened to your advice to kill Duncan, because I thought that was the snake-like thing to do, the violent part, and it's backfired on me. I have bought myself an empty scepter, as he calls it. The crown is empty, it doesn't sit on my head properly. I'm just borrowing it until Fleance comes along and takes it, not just for himself, but for the generations to come. So this brings us to the patriarchal society, where Macbeth is now criticising himself for listening to Lady Macbeth. She is his social inferior because she's only a queen. She's his social inferior because she's female. And he's now castigating himself, telling himself off for having listened to this woman's plan. So this is a moment of sexism within his marriage where he rejects what Lady Macbeth has said. Now, how far he's aware of that, it's up to you to decide, but Shakespeare wants us to think of that, which is why he focuses on the snake and deliberately reminds us of the image that Lady Macbeth gave us earlier. And so you could argue this is the major turning point in the play in terms of their marriage. This is when he finally decides to reject his wife, which eventually results in her committing suicide. So now let's look at the theme of Christianity and the great chain of being, another theme that's closely linked. Well, obviously, in Shakespeare's day, the image of a serpent and a snake is directly relevant to their understanding of Genesis. So they would immediately see the symbol as the snake, signifying Satan, signifying the temptation of Adam and Eve to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge and good and evil. So here, Macbeth has in his own mind his own failing. He listened to his wife, who here is tempting him to kill Duncan, and has led to his downfall. The downfall is that he's king, but he knows that his kingship is not secure. So this is him blaming Lady Macbeth in the same way that God attaches more blame to Eve than Adam. The reason God attaches more blame to Eve is that the serpent first tempted Eve. He couldn't necessarily tempt Adam, he used Eve to do it, and therefore women got a very raw deal in the patriarchal society, because even the Bible suggested that they were more sinning than the men. We will also be able to link this to, oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife, this idea that his mind is being overtaken by animals. We can suggest that it's making him less human because he has gone against God. So this symbol quite clearly represents how he's turned against God's teaching by committing regicide, and his punishment is he now has these poisonous animals, snakes and scorpions, actually living inside his brain, symbolically because that's the imagery he thinks in, and also semi-literally because he feels their sting. Now, when we add the image of fire to this metaphor, we can quite clearly see the link to hell that's being suggested here, and Macbeth, or Shakespeare, depending on how you want to look at it, is signalling the fact that Macbeth's soul will now go to hell because he has committed regicide. In case you're not familiar with the theory of the great chain of being, this was a religious way of making sure that the politics of the day kept the king at the top of the social order. So the idea was God decided who would rule on earth and appointed them by his divine permission. And therefore, if you became king or queen in the natural course of events, it meant that God had selected you to be there, and therefore the lords and ladies underneath you were also selected by God to be lords and ladies and not king and queen. And then the people who served the lords and ladies were chosen by God to serve the lords and ladies, and then the animals were chosen by God to serve the people. Well, the whole point of this is to make sure that the social system does not change. So this is an anti-democratic system. It says that the law has to sit with the kings and queens in the country because they're God's representatives, and therefore it makes sure that the people who have power and wealth keep power and wealth because they can happily believe that it is God's plan for them to remain wealthy and powerful. And similarly, it's God's plan for those who are not wealthy and powerful to remain so. So Macbeth, of course, has rejected that by killing the king. He's decided to take matters in his own hands and challenge God's decision directly. And therefore, he receives this punishment. And it's important for Shakespeare to show Macbeth being punished while he's alive. So he's not just being punished by being eventually killed by Macduff. He's being punished by having all those pleasures that he looked forward to destroyed. And this kind of animal imagery helps Shakespeare dramatise the destruction of Macbeth's peace of mind. And the harshness of this torture is emphasised with the consonants. So we've got the hard K of killed and the hard T of not. The K is echoed again in snake, and scorched echoes the K as well. So this is consonants. It's not alliteration because it's not all at the beginning of the word. And obviously you've probably spotted the sibilants of scorched and snake, the repetition of the S sound, just to reinforce the sinister nature of Macbeth's thoughts, but also the torture, the mental torture that he's now undergoing. Right, when we now link it to the idea of fate and destiny, we can start talking about the supernatural. So in this metaphor, Macbeth rejects the idea of fate. He doesn't think that it is inevitable that Banquo's son should become king. He thinks that this could have been prevented, which is why he hires the murderers to kill Banquo and Fleance. However, the next part of this line is, she will return and be herself. So from that perspective, we could argue that he now thinks he is fated to lose his kingship to Fleance, and he now believes that the witch's prophecies are true. Now, when we take that perspective, this means he believes in fate and destiny. He believes that his life has been mapped out. However, within that, he still has the free will, just like Banquo did. Banquo chose to wait. He used his own free will to allow fate to happen naturally. The problem with Macbeth is that he used his free will to accelerate his fate. He chose to make his own destiny by becoming king, made himself king much quicker, but also made sure that that kingship was not enjoyed and was brief. And when we get to the end of the play, Fleance is not mentioned, so Fleance is still only about 10 or 11 years old at the end of the play, and there's no way he can become king because Malcolm is instead crowned king. Consequently, Shakespeare is pointing out that kingship can happen quite naturally. There may well be a perfectly natural explanation for why Malcolm ceases to be king and Fleance becomes king later. It may well be that Malcolm never has children, or it may be that Malcolm chooses Banquo to become king, because remember, in this society it's not the king's son who necessarily becomes king. That's why it's a bit of a surprise when Duncan does choose his own son Malcolm to follow him as his heir. Now the snake imagery also, as we said, reminds us of the serpent tempting Adam and Eve, and this links us to the supernatural element. Shakespeare is asking us, did the witches become like the snake, tempting Macbeth to believe in this fate and therefore tempting him to commit murder? Now this is a really interesting question for you, because you will look at the witches' words and they never tell Macbeth to do anything evil whatsoever. They don't suggest that he needs to murder anyone. They don't suggest that he takes any action at all. They simply tell him what will happen. When he returns to the witches, they actually give him one thing that he must do, which is beware Macduff. But even this Macbeth messes up, and instead of killing Macduff, he slaughters Macduff's family once Macduff has left. In fact, we could argue that in slaughtering Macduff's family, he gives Macduff much more reason to kill him. So if we think that only Macduff could have killed Macbeth because it was only Macduff who was not born of a woman, this would suggest the witches were actually helping Macbeth. Their supernatural power was actually beneficial. They actually said to Macbeth, look, Macduff is the person you have to worry about, and if he'd heeded that advice, Macduff would not have killed him. And that's quite an interesting way of looking at it, because when we look at Banquo, the witches also gave Banquo news that turned out to be really good. So what we see now is that their supernatural influence is being able to see into the future, but they're not able to change it. They don't seem to be able to change that future. When they try to tell Macbeth, beware Macduff, he actually messes that up. And this would suggest that Macbeth's fate is entirely in his own hands, not the witches. So we can easily deal with these other themes now. You could easily see from what I've taught you already how this metaphor of the snake conveys Macbeth's guilt, and so this snake is turning against him in his mind. We can also see it as a divine punishment for his immoral act of committing regicide, and also for killing Banquo. So this is his punishment for being immoral. We can also see how he has not understood power correctly. He could have acquired power naturally, like Banquo does for Fleance, but instead he doesn't. He acquires it like a snake does, through subterfuge, and therefore he suffers for it. We talked about how he regrets giving power to his wife, because we could look at that as a patriarchal view, that he shouldn't have given power to his wife, and now realizes that he made the mistake of listening to her. We've talked about how Banquo has been a much wiser recipient of the witch's prophecies than Macbeth, and how his sacrifice has guaranteed the history of his son and his descendants. We've linked it to the witch's advice about Macduff, so we could use it to answer a question about him, and how his vengeance is spurred on by Macbeth killing his family instead of heeding the witch's advice to beware Macduff himself. Now, it's less easy to link it to Duncan, but we've got a way in where I told you about Duncan's decision to nominate Malcolm as king. So Macbeth may well be looking into the future here and thinking that Fleance would not just get rid of Macbeth, but would also get rid of the threat of Malcolm. And this is why he still sees Fleance's survival as a snake. He believes that Fleance will grow to be much more powerful than himself or whoever succeeds him. It's very likely that he wouldn't expect Fleance to come and defeat him in battle, because Fleance is only 10 years old. And we can see from the way that Macbeth behaves that he's paranoid against losing power all the time. Now, Shakespeare is taking a very small risk with this portrayal, because Banquo appears, although wiser than Macbeth, still cunning like a snake. It's not necessarily a wholly positive portrayal, and the risk involved there is that King James was widely believed to have been descended from Banquo. His way out of that, of course, is that he's not descended so much from Banquo as from Fleance. In other words, there's the opportunity to portray Fleance as growing into an even better human being than his father, and therefore King James might be descended from somebody even more noble than Banquo, if you like, more recently in his lineage. But we could also see it as an unconscious way that Shakespeare might also be critical of King James. Perhaps he sees the main quality of any king or queen is their snake-like quality. They're dangerous and they're cunning. And perhaps the play suggests that none of them are good enough people to rule. That, however, would not be the message for most of the audience. For his contemporary audience, he would be trying to show that people need to behave in a Christian way. The ultimate crime is to kill the king. This is a warning to all the nobles at court who might be thinking of getting rid of King James, which is highly relevant, as you remember, because the gunpowder plot has only recently occurred, where the Catholics not only thought about killing the king, but also most of the other nobles in the country who would have been at Parliament at the time. So this gives you a sophisticated answer where you're arguing that the play has one message for the lords and the king who are watching it, but actually another message when we read it deeper and we see Shakespeare's dissatisfaction with the nature of those who become king and queen. Or not. You don't have to take that perspective at all. you can decide that he is totally in favour of King James, and we don't need to read into it any implied criticism at all. So there you go, one quotation to fit any question on Macbeth. Hope you enjoyed it. Good luck. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you soon on my channel.